I'm Ryan, this is 52SE Friday, week 12. This is the 360. Started in my basement, now in my office. Started as a teaching tank for a series for all of you, but ended up as a teaching tank for me. I learned more from this tank than any other, the 360, an inspiration for this series and how we approach the 7 other tanks. An update, and the 3 biggest lessons are coming up. This is where the 360's at, packed in life. Some corals are a foot across, covering one 5.5-foot viewing pane, and coming along, a second 5.5-foot pane with a totally different perspective on the tank. And my favorite, the end of the peninsula that has that 5.5-foot sense of depth with the ability to see the fish interact with the tank. Looks good, but there's room for improvement, and you'll see that throughout this series. Ultimately, this will end as one of the best display tanks that we've ever done. So how did we get here? 3 years ago, we put this tank in my house and it was going to be the best series that we've ever done. Instead, it had a string of challenges and by far the hardest tank that I've ever attempted. Shortly after, my family moved homes and the tank went to my office where it was largely a fish tank for a while. But that's not where the story ended. Victor from WWC came out to add a variety of frags in the tank, but with a tank this big, it was going to take a while and we needed more. Elliot and I have been working to fill it with fish to bring it to life, and later the XXL 750 had a structural issue, so we migrated many of the corals from there to the 360. This tank is going to be what we all wanted, the best tank that we've ever done on BRStv. In some ways, you already know the biggest challenges that we face with this tank and how we would approach it differently next time, because we already did that with the other 7 tanks in 52SE. But there are 4 lessons that evolved how we'd approach almost every tank now, and you're about to hear them. The first lesson that 360 taught me was that patience alone is not enough. It's commonly true that nothing good in a reef tank happens fast. And that's not entirely true, but it gets to the heart of there's thousands of unknowns and knowns and poorly understood processes in a reef tank, particularly in a new one. One path is to attempt to understand and manage all of these biological processes. The other is just to accept that patience and time seems to let all this sort itself out on its own. Sometimes called cycling, curing the tank, other times just referred to as finding stability. All pretty vague words, but the general recommendation is that just time and patience will find that stability. However, that wasn't the case for the 360. We let this tank run for months before turning on the lights. This was the most patient I've ever been with the tank, trying to share good practices with all of you and set the tank up for a successful series. But once we turned the lights on, it went south fast. The tank was covered in slimes and bacterial blooms relentlessly. The contributing problems that caused that are now obvious after the fact. The first thing is time doesn't replace what's missing. It had to be there to begin with. And just because you can't see it doesn't mean that it's not real. There's an entire other universe of life in the tank that often goes unseen by the naked eye. They say that seeing is believing. Break out the microscope and you can see a wealth of life, microcrustaceans, microalgae, diatoms, dinoflagellates, bacteria, archaea, all fighting for limited resources, territory, and balance with each other. The only time that you can see them is when they're not in balance with each other and one organism completely overruns a tank, or at least part of it. The first reason the slimes won in the 360 is because you can't have balance with something that's simply not there. We didn't intentionally introduce the right things during those initial months, and the net result is we started without microcrustaceans, the right bacteria and archaea, to balance things out with slimes, undesirable bacteria, diatoms, and dinos. With a dry rock bare bottom tank and limited deliberate microbiome introduction like the 360, it's just a total crapshoot of what shows up and when. The photosynthetic slimes have the most abundant source of energy and take off the fastest. That's what happened in the 360. After the fact, this all seems pretty obvious, so why was what I'd call biome cycling now not part of the startup process of the 360? At that point, I've been reefing for 15 plus years and set up countless tanks, so it seems as though I should have learned this before. The reason is because with my first tanks, patience alone was enough. Eventually, patience wasn't even required as I figured out a series of steps over a decade to near insta-tanks. However, the 360 forced a necessity and a desire to develop a deeper understanding of supporting biology and why these paths worked to identify and solve why they don't work every time with every tank style. The answer is found in those unseen microscopic wars that are happening in our tanks. The primary difference, it turns out, is most of my decade of near insta tanks were LPS tanks. There were 3 reasons why that matters. First, the nature of an LPS tank is a skeletal structure of these corals introduces a wealth of natural bacteria, archaea, and microcrustaceans. And you'll always use the ocean direct sand, which introduces bacteria of the ocean. There's also around 75% less light energy fueling the photosynthetic slimes we call the ugly stage, so they replicate dramatically slower. And time or patience is just a solution of its own. With the 360, it was a bare bottom, so there was no introduction with sand. It was an SPS tank where you don't typically add corals until after the tank is stable, so there's no introduction that way either. Some of the uglies were likely introduced from my well water, hands, or air. They were fueled at low levels for months from the ambient room light, but once the lights came on, the tank didn't just have 300 par. Our lighting solution was a blanket covering nearly every surface in the tank. All that combined was a perfect storm for the mother of all ugly stages. And at that point, the series is in full swing, the pressure is on, and patience no longer seems like a legit option. So I try a series of hammer solutions. Knowing what I know now, I would have simply just blacked out the tank, covered the glass for a month or two, introduced microbiome to compete with it, and scaled the lights up slowly. So while in real time that was not fun, there's no progress without challenges, and I wouldn't be able to teach others how to avoid them without having them, and that's the heart of 52SE. With two of the SPS tanks, the Chromis and SPS collectors, we use the most aggressive approach to microbiome there is with TBS wet live rock and their sand, which is rock and sand that's already found balance in nature under sun level light, collected and shipped to you in water. We let it run in ambient light for a few weeks to set the photosynthetics back, turned on the light, and it produced a near effortless result. With the anemone tank, which runs those same high par levels, we use dry, sterilish rock, but then use TBS sand to introduce biome, a month or so of ambient light to let it populate the rock without competing with all the photosynthetics, and then turn the lights on. Same near effortless results. LPS and Softy and Nano, a less aggressive approach with all sterilish dry rock, mostly Ocean Direct retail bag sand, just a couple pounds of TBS sand mixed in, same effortless results. There are different results related to different approaches, and that's part of another lesson, which is while all 7 tanks share many similarities, it's not what's the same that defines their outcome. It's the small differences that produce big changes in the results, something that we'll share in the update episode, which is in the next episode of this series. One of the other things that these tanks received was a dose of Galaxy pods from Algae Barn before the lights came on. I used to believe that you can't keep pods out of the tank, so why bother buying them? Now I understand the value of establishing that population before the lights come on and we start fueling those photosynthetic uglies. The TBS rock and sand would probably do that on their own, but it's worth it to me to have a multifaceted approach to microcrustaceans. Turns out the hardest tank of my life is the most valuable experience that I've had to date. Inspired series like the biome experiments, challenging discussions with my peers, and an experience that I wouldn't give up for anything now. The second lesson the 360s taught me is the correct answer is always found in the biology of the fish and coral. Until the 360, I spent more time thinking about environmental factors like chemistry, lighting, filtration, and flow. I've been through 3 unique stages of that, and now think about reefing and marine tanks in a totally different way that guides different, more successful decisions. When I first started reefing 20 years ago, I didn't know a thing about marine fish, coral, or seawater. All I was doing is hunting for knowledge in the pursuit of a list of instructions that would help me do this, more or less a shopping and to-do list. How successful I was completely dependent on the quality of the recipe I followed or developed, and then my willingness to actually follow it. The next 15 years were spent perfecting that recipe for success through a better understanding of these corals' natural environment, exploration of supporting technology, and how the fish and corals react to our best attempt to emulate nature. Then the 360 happened. My experience with this tank inspired the next evolution that I've been on for the last 3 years. Shifting from the pursuit of knowledge on emulating the environment found in Indonesia, Fiji, Australia, or even successful tanks in the pursuit of knowledge of the biology of the animals that are actually in the tank and what supports them. The shift from environment to biology may not seem that big, but what it really means is not treating all the animals in the tank as though they're the same. It also means that not dying isn't a measurement of success. Thriving is. Knowing just how to do it or a list isn't enough. I want to know why it works. The answer to that is how we collectively find the next evolutions for our hobby. Much of this is obvious with terrestrial animals, and I'll give you a couple examples in a second, but for some reason less so with the aquatic animals that we care for. For example, a cat, a rabbit, koala, and raccoon are all small furry animals. Cat largely an opportunistic carnivore with a high protein, high fat diet. If you feed a cat a plant-based high carbohydrate diet, it will develop diabetes and die over time. A rabbit is a constant grazer of high carbohydrate, high fiber plant-based diet. If you feed a rabbit a high protein diet, it develops a problem similar to constipation. The digestive tract fails and it dies over time. A koala would sooner starve to death than eat anything other than the very specific type of eucalyptus leaf, a leaf that's poisonous to most other animals. A raccoon will eat basically anything: fruits, plants, nuts, berries, insects, rodents, frogs, eggs, and even garbage. One step further, the hummingbird, a high-energy burning animal that needs to eat its body weight in food a day or it will starve to death over time. From a biology perspective, more or less what I'm finding is most of the fish that we call easy and live for decades or a natural lifespan in a reef tank are more raccoon-like. Animals that live for a few years but often don't make it in the end, more cat or rabbit-like with specific requirements that are not being met or only partially met. Animals that rapidly disappear are more hummingbird-like, a very specific need or caloric intake that's not being met. This concept applies to corals as well. We group them into LPS, SPS, softy, and similar groups. But all corals don't utilize light, water flow, inorganic and organic nutrients the same way or thrive in the same water quality with the same chemistry. Ablastomusa, acro, torch, chalice, and other organisms like our magnifica have all evolved to live in very different environments. Getting to the bottom of that is how we build better, easier, lasting reef tanks with the utmost respect for the animals, all based on their unique biology. The third lesson the 360 gave me is progress doesn't come from defending what we know. It comes from challenging it and taking the risks required to learn something new. New doesn't have to be truly revolutionary new, just new to you. If enough of us try something and it works or doesn't work, we'll find out not just if it works or not, but the repeatable nuances of where it does and doesn't, and collectively inspire others where the real advancement for the entire hobby has been made. As I mentioned earlier, in the 360 started as a teaching tank in a series for all of you, but ended up as a teaching tank for me, and that's where it'll stay. These are some of the things that I'd like to learn more about. The corals in the 750 had acro-eating flatworms, meaning now the 360 has them, with other parasites as well, I'm sure. My fish came from marine collectors, pre-treated for parasites, but there are 100 ways they can get exposed to parasites at our facility, most commonly from coral introductions or accidental exposure from other tanks. Prevention efforts will always be the primary and best path. But if that fails, it may be time to own that the ocean has parasites. It's normal for them to be in our tanks. Can we use competitive organisms or pest predators, water flow, or efforts towards optimal health, and maybe a bit of elbow grease to find balance? We'll see that with this tank. Next, I've always had an interest in oxidants like peroxide and ozone, just rarely use them because of the unknowns. I now believe that there's a long list of corals where an oxidant dip like peroxide is the best option out there for the removal of pests, algae, eggs, and other tank pests. The question is how long, what strength, and what corals tolerate it. I also use oxidants directly in the tank by running ozone, ORP controlled, on at 350 and off at 400, but only on for an hour a night at midnight. Doing it at night limits the ozone in the facility and tank. Water's crystal clear now 100% of the time, even without carbon, even look through 5.5 feet of the tank. It was also a solution to a brown slime that I was dealing with for ages. Hard to say if the small amount of oxidants directly affected the slime's biology or if just simply changed something like its food source. Another lesson that I want to learn more about is the difference between antiseptics like iodine, which cleans surfaces to prevent infection, and antibiotics, which treat existing infections. I lost half of my torches and hammers and frog spawn to brown jelly at one point. I tried antiseptics, which seemed to set it back, but didn't solve it. But now thinking about iodine as a preventative, I understand why it wasn't a lasting, effective method on the existing brown jelly. After speaking to many of my peers, most believe that most types of rapid mortalities and tissue loss of otherwise healthy corals are related to some type of tissue damage and/or secondary infection. Antibiotics are the treatment for infections. I wish I had tried antibiotics either in bass or directly in the tank. Antibiotics are somewhat of a controversial topic, but I've heard enough from the people that I trust to believe that they can be a tool that helps me respect and care for the animals in the 360 and the lessons learned from that all of the tanks under my care. This is also my first tank where I tried something new with lighting. Rather than debate which brand or technology is right, simply provide light that is much closer to the type of light found at 15 to 30 feet deep in the tropics. Mean a strong peak of blue, indigo, and a moderate amount of violet light, which are the primary areas where chlorophyll and carotenoids absorb energy. Then a balanced approach of about 8 to 10% of green, yellow, orange, and red for color. You'll hear me refer to this as solar blue, which means mimics the sun's full spectrum properties, but just weighted to a very cool blue. So far this has been successful enough that we implemented a version of it on all of the 52SE tanks, but with variants. With the anemone tank, we're exploring the addition of more red, which considers that this animal is often found much closer to the surface where red is not filtered out. With the LPS tank, less red and a bit less violet to respect that these animals are found deeper, and some of these spectrums are filtered out to various degrees. This tank is also the first time that I've embraced heavy feeding as a solution to proper nutrition for the fish. I have Avansi anthias and purple queens that are the tank's equivalent of a hummingbird. I have auto feeders on this tank feeding them 1 to 2 pellets per fish every hour during the day. To compensate for that, a combination of a felt roller, auto water changes, and the Kato-based fuge with a full spectrum Kessel tuna sun. In the end, the coral and fuge, and maybe even just the corals in a couple of years, will be all that's needed to uptake the excess nutrients. I'm also exploring a preference for alternating strong flushing currents over turbulent flow. Achieving that in a peninsula is immediately challenging, but seeing how corals grow into the ideal flow because it promotes the ideal biology has me constantly pursuing how to do this the best way possible. The fourth and probably the most important lesson is dare greatly. At one point the 360 felt like my biggest, most public failure. I certainly took some heat and I absolutely wanted to shut it down at times. But after 15 years of shooting videos like this one, over 100 million lessons shared on YouTube, and countless tanks, there's a quote from Theodore Roosevelt called "The Man in the Arena" that keeps me going. Particularly when it's hard, give it a read, maybe it'll give you the courage to keep going when your tank challenges you. The basis of that is certainly I've stumbled at times, some deeds could have been done better, but the 360 is a reminder that there's no effort without error or shortcoming. Also a reminder that finding the great enthusiasms, devotions, and triumph of high achievement requires us to dare greatly together. The 360's only begun its journey now. The other 7 tanks in 52SE are due for an update, and that's coming in just a few weeks. The science episode's rolling directly after that. That and all the other episodes of 52SE found right here.